So anyway, my name is David, and I'm really happy to be here today to conduct a process management workshop. It's one of the first workshops actually we put together, well, from the days that we used to be a consulting company way back when. But since we transitioned over into a business process software company, this is one of the first workshops that we're offering to both clients and people who are not clients as well. So a little bit before I get into the actual workshop itself, we got a good mix of both clients and non-clients. So for those of you who don't know us, we're Navia. We started our journey back in the year 2000 as a process consulting company. So everything I'm going to be talking about today really comes from experience, from the practice of actually doing business process consulting, process improvement, process implementation. So we did that work for many years, working in large organizations like Coca-Cola and Staples and the New York Stock Exchange, Bank of New York Mellon, and gained a lot of practical experience on how to design, document, and implement processes. Fast forwarded a number of years, we built a tool that we used in our own consulting practice to help our consultants be more productive in doing business process mapping, as well as process documentation. That tool became the Navia product. So today we're really going to be looking at the art, if you will, of business process management. We might pop into Navia for a bit just to do some demonstrations of process mapping techniques, but the focus here today is to share information with you folks, and hopefully you get something out of it. The objective was to create a workshop that was accessible to a broad range of attendees. You know, whether you're a manager, a process owner, a process manager, or if you're someone actually responsible for process design and implementation, I think there's going to be some material in here that will resonate with you. So the other thing, as Catherine mentioned, let's keep this interactive. If you have a question and maybe it's not being covered by my slides and the material, feel free to put it into the chat and we'll be happy to address that. There are a lot of people on the call today, so Catherine's going to be pretty busy moderating the chat, but you're in good hands with Catherine. So the agenda for today's workshop: what is a process? I mean, that may sound a little funny since we're here to talk about process mapping, but a lot of times from my experience, there is confusion to what a process actually is. What is process mapping, to distinguish the two? The type of process maps that you can use. There's various techniques in terms of process mapping, and we're going to cover some of the different types of process maps that you may want to use in your own endeavors. We're going to get into collaborative process mapping. So how you can engage various stakeholders in the art of pulling this process information out of their minds and down onto paper. So we're going to talk a little bit about that activity of collaborative process mapping. We're going to get into process analysis a little bit, and what do you do when you have this information? How can you analyze it to make the process better? So we'll talk on that topic for a bit. We'll also touch upon the topic of process maps versus process documentation. We'll also get into creating process maps, and then we'll wrap things up. So before I actually get into the material, I just want to pose this question. What are you folks hoping to get out of today's session? I'll jot down some notes here, and that might help me as I go through the material to come back to some of the things that you're hoping to get out of today's session. So if you will, just put into the chat maybe what you're hoping to get out of today, and I'll be happy to do my best to try and address some of those things. Not seeing anything coming up in the chat, which... here we go. How you identify applications used on each step of the process. We're definitely going to be looking at that. Note which type of process map with what level of detail. Yep, you're reading my mind. We're going to be getting into that as well. How do you integrate with Lean IX? We can talk about that when we get to the process analysis piece. Okay, well there's some good comments here. So why don't we just move forward and get right into the session today. So what is a process? Nice. I know that sounds silly, right? We're here on a process mapping workshop, and to start with something as simple as what is a process. But from my experience, I found there's a lot of confusion about process. People document processes at so many different levels. Sometimes they're extremely high level, which has value, but doesn't give you everything you need to know about performing the procedures or the work instructions related with that process. Sometimes they're too much in the weeds and you just lose sight of the big picture and you get lost in the detail. So let's take a moment here to define what a process is. So a process is a series of interrelated activities and tasks performed in a specific sequence by people or systems, because you can have process automation, that results in a product or service for a customer. So some of the key words here that I like to focus on: you're delivering something with a process. Your output is a product or a service for a customer. And the process itself needs to transform information coming into the process into that product and service going out. And hopefully you're adding value along the way. The process transforms inputs into value-added outputs. And a process needs to be measured and controlled against a set of established control objectives and KPIs. So let's take a little look here at what a process is. Now, I'm going to try and keep this interactive, so if some people can help me out here, that would be appreciated. Does anyone have an example of what might be an input to a process? Any ideas of what might be an input to a process? People are still responding to the first question, what they're hoping to get out of the thing. Oh, okay, document data, requirements, a user request. A user request is a great example of an input for a process. A bill of lading, yes. Inputs can be a request from somebody. It could be a piece of information, either from a system or a document. So that's a really good one. A change. If you're an IT professional, you have a requirement to do a change. The input to the change management process would be a change request. So inputs are the resources needed to complete the process. And a lot of times I notice that people do not document the inputs and the outputs of part of their process mapping efforts. And it's really important that you do it, especially when you want to do the analysis, because understanding the inputs and the outputs can help you with process automation and other activities. Then you have your series of interrelated activities. So if it was, let's use the change management example that came up a little while ago. So for those of you who might not be information technology related, a change management process is used anytime an organization wants to implement new technology or make a change to existing technology in the environment, and they want to do that in a way that's very non-disruptive, doesn't cause an outage. So that whole thing gets kicked off with a change management request. Once it goes into the process, there's a number of activities. So the first activity would be receive this request and register it into the system. Then somebody has to look at this request and evaluate it to see if it's something that's worth doing or if it's risky. So they have to look at that request and decide what they're going to do with it. Then they have to approve the request. That's the next activity. It's approving. Then people have to go off and build and test and make sure that change is ready to go, that you have backup plans to remove the change from production in case it went wrong. And then the last activity of the change management process would be the actual closing out of the change record. So those sequence of activities transform a change request into an output, and that would be a successfully implemented change. But there's other types of inputs and outputs to the change management process as well. An input could be a request for information. So for example, if I want to have a list of the upcoming changes, I can input that request into the change management process, and the output of the change management process would provide you with what we call in IT, the forward schedule of changes. So inputs and outputs can be things like a request, can be information. I saw some people put things up on the board like a bill of lading, Those types of things can be inputs and outputs to the process. Now, I see some people mentioning things like policies and controls. Those actually, the way we see this is that they don't act so much as inputs to the process, but they sit on top of the process, governing the process. So controls refer to basically objectives, policies, targets that govern the operation of the process. Think of it, think of it as a set of like knobs and sliders that you can set, and you're looking to make sure that your process is basically within those targets. So if you're in a, let's say a power generation plant, you might have different controls that are set so that you're, boilers for steam generation don't get above a certain temperature. Those would be controls in more of a process, manufacturing or process-oriented environment, manufacturing or physical environment. But the same kinds of controls can apply to your business processes. You might have regulatory requirements. Those controls like Sarbanes-Oxley, controls that come out of the frameworks like COBIT, controls that come out of frameworks like ISO 27001 for security. These types of controls sit on top of your process and sort of guide the operation of it. So you've got your inputs, your sequence of activities that deliver outputs, and sitting on top of the process are the controls that ensure that your process is meeting the objectives. But how do you measure the process? That's the measurements, metrics, KPIs. So the process works as a system. Your controls govern its operation, but you also want to measure the process to make sure that it's meeting the desired, that it's providing the desired results. So the measurements are a way of looking at the process. Are we delivering what we say we're going to be delivering? And then we can use those measurements to go into continual improvement. And I see someone else popping in here. Yes, traditionally inputs are transformed, controls are not. That's a very good point. Controls oversee and govern the process, while measures let you know, those are your dashboards basically that let you know how it's operating, but inputs are transformed outputs. There's also a lot of confusion about process versus procedure. Just raise your hands. Does anyone ever run into that in your own environment where there's confusion between process and procedure? Because we see that all the time. And in traditional process mapping, processes really are all about the what needs to be done and who is responsible for doing it. A process is technology independent. Me. I like that, Robin. Lucas, almost always. Yeah, I can see people responding to this one. And it's hard, right? Because you want to get, you know what was funny? I was showing these slides to my wife, and my wife, her job is extreme, her background is chemical engineering, and her job is extremely process oriented. And when I was explaining, the procedure, she just says, it's hard sometimes because we always want to jump into the work instructions for getting something done. But it's kind of like a map, right? If you think about it, if you're going on a journey, let's say, I'm going on a hike. I like to hike. So let's say I'm hiking in Patagonia and I want to get from, the starting point to Gray's Glacier. Well, I want to see an overview of where I'm going, right? I want to know what I have to accomplish. And of course, I know who's doing it. That's me and the team. But I want to see an overview. I don't need to know at this point all the little, point-by-point turns and how I'm going to set up my tent on the first night and how I'm going to get water on the second day. You want to see the big process, the big picture, because that's where you can identify things like bottlenecks. That's where you can identify issues with communication between departments. So you need to see a thing at a high level. Gets too much into the weeds, you lose that big picture, and it's hard to do improvement. So a process describes what needs to be done and who is responsible for doing it. A process is always technology independent. So what do I mean by that? So if I design a process, it could be something like, processing an expense, an employee's expense. So I know what the process is. You have the creation of the expense report might be one activity. You have the review and approval of the expense report, which might be the second activity. And the third activity would be actually, fulfilling the expense report and providing it to somebody. I can define that whole process without talking about, I'm not doing it in JD Edwards, or I'm not doing it in SAP, or whatever tools you might use for your process management. Your expense management. I can describe that process and apply that process to the next tool we buy or another tool. It needs to be the process needs to be technology independent. And typically processes are cross-functional and can span multiple departments. When you get into procedures, they're usually very focused on an individual or a department. So what's the procedure for, I'm an employee, what's the procedure for submitting an expense report? Well, that's me, right? I'm executing the procedure, but the process shows the whole flow from someone creating the expense report to the person getting paid out at the end. Just looking at some of the comments, in most industries or organizations, policies, and procedures are so intertwined always. And you know what? You have to have all three: process, policies, procedures. You need to understand the activities, the work instructions, but you also kind of need to break them apart so that you can properly manage the business process. So procedures describe how to perform specific steps in the process. So this would be like, how do I submit an expense report? How do I submit a change request? How do I ask for a new laptop? That gets down to a procedure, because that means you're logging into a system and you're filling out a form. A process doesn't need, at the high level, to describe the details of what you have to fill in. As you decompose the process into its work instructions, that's where that step happens. And I've seen way too often documents that are a mixture of process and procedure, and you kind of lose the big picture, but then you get into a lot of detail. So just remember that when you're building out your process. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this as we go through the slides. Procedures are typically technology specific if they are in any way supported by tools. This is where you log into a system. This is where you perform you interact with the automation tools to actually get the process, that procedure within the process done. And they typically are departmental or personal. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Just some comments back about the description between process and procedure. Thank you. So one of the ways of understanding this is through an organizational structure, a way of categorizing processes. So we call that process levels. And I've done a lot of reading on process levels. There's a few different techniques out there, but they're all pretty much the same. The level might be a little different at different spots, but you'll see as you go through it. Process levels are extremely important because it's a great way of creating an inventory of all your processes for the organization, and then decompose them down all the way to the work instructions for supporting a specific process. So process levels start with level 1, the organizational function. Is this a finance process, an administration process, an HR process, an IT process? Where in the organization does the process live? And that could be in your naming convention, right? You can have like some denominator in the process that, or some prefix in the process that identifies this is clearly a finance process or an admin process. So level 1, where are you? Level 2, in every silo in the organization, there are different groupings of processes. So you can have strategic process, operational processes. In IT, you can have a group of development processes, operational processes, of support processes. So that's the second level, which is grouping. Yes, we will be sharing the slides, by the way. All of this stuff will be shared. So that's the second level. First level, where? And then what group of processes I'm talking about. So you're narrowing it in. The third level, that is the actual process within a group. The fourth level, process activities. These are the high-level process activities. And the best way I have of communicating this think of any process. If you can try to articulate that process in no more than 5 or 6 steps. So take the change management process I gave before. You have the registration of a change, you have the review and assessment of a change, you have the approval of the change, you have the building and testing of the change, and then closing up with the change record. But each of those activities can have many steps in it. When you're building out and testing the change, there's that whole build test process. You need to have a backup plan. There's going to be an entire workflow diagram just around building and testing the change. But if I'm articulating the change to management, I can make it very simple. I can say, it's registration, it's assessment, it's approval, it's build, test, and implement, and then closing out the change. Going down another level are the tasks and specific steps within an activity. This is where you're really getting into the RACI chart, the person of who's doing it, because now you're identifying a piece of work that needs to be done, and you can assign that to a person with accountability, etc. So you're down at that level now in the process. And then the 6th level, and some people leave this in or out, those are the procedures to perform the task. So levels 1 to 5 are really all about the categorization of the process. Level 6 brings in procedures, which is the individual steps to basically to fulfill that task within the process. Okay, so if there are any questions, just throw them out. Any so far? Oh, great question. To me, they're the same thing. Standard operating procedure, work instruction. So procedure, work instruction, standard operating procedure. These names are interchangeable, but it goes back to that definition I gave a little while before. It's how to do something. It's not what you're doing, but how to do it, and it's usually related to a tool. Okay, so let me give you an example of the process levels here. So level 1, human resources. Cool. Level 2, we have a group of because HR has a lot of processes. There's processes around benefits management. There's processes around dealing with employee performance. There's probably 5 or 6 different groupings of processes within the HR organization. But this particular grouping is managing employee development, onboarding, and training. So it's all about bringing your people into the organization and making sure that they're developed and they're trained and all that good stuff is in place. So that's the group. Level 3, I'm going to focus on onboarding. So that's the process level. Level 4, in the employee onboarding process, there's probably half a dozen activities. Preparation. So what's preparation? It's getting ready for the employee to come. The second major activity would be orientation. Once they come, you want to give them a tour, introduce them to various people, show them around where the cafeteria is, where the coffee machine is. Orientation. Number 3, any kind of paperwork they have to do. They have to provide information for payroll, information for the benefits program. Another activity, IT. What user IDs, what passwords, all of those things. There might be a facilities activity where they're going to sit, what phone line are they going to have, that kind of stuff. And then the last activity might be some kind of quality assurance or follow-up with the employee once they've been onboarded. You see, that's basically the HR onboarding process. Prepare, orient, do your paperwork, get them provisioned into IT and systems, and get them their facilities, and then follow up. But we can then break one of these down. For example, the IT piece, break down that activity into the tasks. So I want to provision accounts. I want to provision devices. I want to give them security awareness training. I want to give them general training about the IT systems within your organization. Maybe I want to do some help desk orientation. Those are the tasks within the IT activity of the employee onboarding process, which is part of the group of processes, employee development, onboard, and training, which is all part of HR. That make any sense? Where do the procedures live at? They live at level 6, like I was showing in the previous chart. Level 6, and again, there are other people define this differently. From my experience, level 6 is where I put the procedures and the work instructions, and it would be underneath. So what are the procedures for provisioning the accounts? What are the procedures for provisioning devices? What's the procedures for doing security awareness training? For example, we do security awareness training here. JC is the guy who manages it for us. And he has all of these procedures to put people into training. There's procedures around, remedial. If you fail a phishing test, there's some remedial training. He has all the procedures for that. So the procedures would fall under here. It'll make more sense when I get into some of the mapping of the processes, I believe. There's a site that I'll refer you guys to. It's APQC, and they have something called the Process Classification Framework, and they've gone and categorized these levels for a variety of processes for an organization. Some of you folks know about APQC. Yeah, some of you guys know about APQC. You can go to apqc.org. They have something you can download for free called the Process Classification Framework. We generally conform to that in this model here. But anyway, I just thought I would share that information with you. In USM process, what is the procedure? Adds the who, work instructions, add the how. That's fine, but we're talking, someone's just commenting about a framework called USM. So USM stands for, I think it's Unified Service Management, if I recall correctly. So the USM is a framework for managing services in an organization. They look at the levels a little bit differently, but like a lot of things, these are best practices and these are guidelines. You can take these and adjust them for your organization as you see fit. But in terms of a traditional process management, these are the levels of how you organize a process. Okay, we're getting to the process mapping piece. So what is process mapping? It's the creation of a visual representation of a sequence of tasks or steps within a process, illustrating inputs, outputs, decision points, and interactions between various roles. I know that maybe the USM folks out there might call this a workflow as opposed to a process, but in traditional process management, the process mapping is about the visual representation of a sequence of tasks or steps within a process, illustrating inputs, outputs, decision points, and interactions between various roles. Now, process mapping does not sit in isolation. Process mapping is a critical element of the business process management lifecycle. So it fits into a broader window. We're going to talk about that in a moment. And the goal of process management is to provide a clear understanding of how the process functions. The reason, and we're going to get into some of the reasons and benefits around process mapping shortly, but we're mapping these processes for a reason. We want to be able to communicate with people. We want to be able to identify issues with the process, bottlenecks. We want to be able to identify perhaps ways to automate the process. But you can't do it unless it's laid out in front of you. You can't automate what you don't understand. You can't measure what you don't understand. So process mapping is all about having a clear understanding of how the process functions. Now, as I mentioned, this falls into a bigger framework called business process management, or BPM. Business process management has a number of phases. So the first phase of business process management is process discovery. Good. I see the question. What is process mining or process optimization? We'll be getting to it in this slide, actually. And someone's asking, what is the difference, workflow versus process? Terminology, a process transforms inputs, outputs in a value-added way. It's a sequence of steps. So it is a flow of work, but there can be flows of work at the procedural level as well. So we like to use the term process and procedure. Back to this slide here, business process management. So the first element of business process management is process discovery. So this is the identification and categorization by business value of the various processes within an organization. Someone was asking a little earlier about process mining. Well, process mining is technology that can use advanced algorithms or AI to technologically discover processes in an organization and present them. But process discovery is usually a combination of manual steps, because not every process in your organization can be mined by technology because they may not be automated. So process discovery is the step where you say, what processes do I have? Let me categorize them. Let me organize them by business value so that I know what I'm dealing with. And process mining can be a very good way of doing some of that. Then, once you've mined your processes, process mapping comes into place, which is the creation of the visual representations or diagrams of processes so you can understand their flows, inputs, outputs, and of course their dependencies. So process mapping happens. Another piece of process mapping is process analysis. I think that question came up in the chat just a moment ago. So also when you're doing the process mapping, that's actually where process analysis fits in. It fits in there and as well as in continual process improvement. But as you're mapping the process, there is an analysis step that's part of process mapping, which we'll be talking about today, which gets into, how do I make this process better? Then you have process automation. Again, you can't automate what you don't understand, so you have to discover your processes, you got to map your processes, then hopefully you can use technology and software to automate repetitive tasks and streamline the processes to save time and money. Then you have process execution. So process execution is where the rubber meets the road. So this is where I coordinate the resources, like who's involved in working with this process? What are the procedures for following this process? How do I monitor this process to ensure that it's being operated? What are the KPIs? What are the metrics? Process execution also involves rolling out the process if it's a new process, training people on the process. So process execution is the ongoing management of that process once it's been discovered, mapped, and automated. And sometimes they're not always automated, but process execution is where the people are getting involved with executing that process. Then we have process governance. Process governance is the alignment of the business process with organizational goals and regulatory requirements through the establishment and enforcement of policies, procedures, and controls. Remember that diagram I started up with: inputs, process, outputs, controls, and metrics. A lot of that happens here in process execution and process governance. Process improvement. This is the ongoing refinement and improvement of processes based on feedback, data analysis, and changing business needs. And the thing I really want to point out here is this is a cycle. This isn't a one-time activity. In some places you might be, I'm working with some folks that just started up a process group. So in many ways, they're starting this from scratch. People are going around saying, what are our processes? Because they're not documented. They need to map them. Then they need to say, hey, is there any chance we can automate these? And how do we operate these once we've got them implemented? How do we govern and process improve them? But again, you could come through this again. If you get to the process improvement cycle, let's say once a year you take a look at your process, say, how can I make it better? You might do some more mapping. You might change the automation. You might have to change how that process is governed because it's part of an ongoing cycle. It's the term process procedure, the industry push programming algorithm. Is the term process procedure the industry push to redefine activities to push society as a whole to a different groupthink programming algorithm? I'm sorry, I don't really understand the question, but I don't think there's anything that I'm not, process and we'll get into some of this in a moment. The whole aspect of process management really started with the Industrial Revolution and advanced manufacturing techniques. So process really isn't, there's nothing nefarious with process. the whole purpose of process is to properly communicate what needs to be done, making sure everybody's doing it, looking for ways to automate and improve it, and give people the knowledge and expertise, and then continually improve that to make things better. I don't think that's groupthink, or I don't think there's anything nefarious about that. I think it's a very good approach to dealing with your business processes. Sometimes we just get caught up with terminology, and we need to look beyond the terminology, I think, sometimes, and look specifically on what the objectives are. And the objectives are to make sure people are on the same page, we all understand what we're doing, that we're doing it consistently so that we're productive and efficient, we're trying to make it better, we're governing it to make sure it doesn't get out of whack, and then we improve it over time, and the goal is to make things better. So the business process management cycle is something that's been around for a long time. It's not something we invented. It's Google Business Process Management, and you'll see it's a technique used to continually improve business operations. So what are some of the benefits of process mapping? And I kind of just articulated some of those. They include such things as identifying inefficiencies. So again, you can't identify issues with your process unless you've actually mapped it out and you can see it from end to end. Improved communication. You know, it's really important that people be on the same page. Having been a process consultant for a big part of my career, it's amazing the miscommunication that goes on with an organization. But having your processes defined at the appropriate levels gives you that ability to improve communication, to keep everyone on the same page. People know what they're doing and they know how to do it. It's also so critical for employee training and onboarding. So if a new employee comes on board and asks how we get things done here, I'm sure some people would raise their hands. You know, I remember starting a job in one place, and I was 3 weeks before I got a PC. And I was basically couldn't even get onto email. So employee training and onboarding is really supported by processes so you can get the employee as efficient and productive as quickly as possible. And also set the expectations for an employee by giving them a good handbook of the processes the organization follows. So I forget what the term is called, the big retire, or there's a term that's happened. We're at a point right now with the aging of the population, the great retirement. But there's a lot of people actually retiring from organizations. If anybody out there knows the term that I'm trying to refer to, but we're getting to, if you look through, at least in North America, the aging population, people are hitting retirement age. We're losing a lot of corporate knowledge, and many organizations, that knowledge is sitting in people's heads, not down on paper. So documenting your processes are a great way of retaining corporate knowledge. I'm going, the silver tsunami. Thank you very much, James. I appreciate that. Retention of corporate knowledge is great. I'm going to go back. There were some questions here I missed, so I'll go back there in a moment. So if I missed your question, I will go back. Retention of corporate knowledge, performance monitoring. Again, you can't measure what you don't understand. If you don't know the steps in the process, how are you going to measure whether the process is performing well? So performance monitoring is very important, as well as risk identification and mitigation. Do we have a security hole here? Are we giving people security training? Are we deploying vulnerability management software to endpoint devices? Risk identification and mitigation is also a very important part of process management. And the blueprint for automation and digital transformation. You know, jump in here if anybody has seen this before. But you know, a digital transformation project kicks off. We're going to automate something, and the first thing they do, they jump right into the tool without documenting the processes. How do you automate something unless you understand what the processes are? So. Stacy, great resignation. Thank you. That's another term for what I was trying to say, so appreciate that. I'm just going to back up a little. I don't know if I can back up. Yes, I can. I'm going to back up in the chat here and see. I think there were some questions. Yeah, we're going to get to the personas and racing matrix. It's one of my slides that'll be coming up, so we'll be able to answer that question. What are the tools recommended to create process diagrams, design flows? Somebody threw out a bunch of different products there. We also, I'll be showing you a little bit of the Navia product. Of course, our product also designs and documents processes, so I'll be happy to do that towards the end of the presentation. All right, types of process maps. Anybody remember this? If you do, it's because if you do remember this, it probably dates you. I had one of these in my shirt pocket when I was first studying to be my IT courses, my programming courses. It's a flowcharting stencil, right? And this is one of the ways that people used to do flowcharting. So the 60s they want their stencil back. That's because these symbols of flowcharting actually came out from that point in time. If you think of flowcharting, it was one of the earliest forms of process mapping. It was introduced, believe it or not, in 1921 in a presentation to the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. And that goes back to, what I was saying earlier. Process management has been around a long time, right? More than my lifetime. So, but they were looking for ways to manufacturing processes primarily in the early days, but they were looking for ways to understand the flow of work through a facility, right? So it was first introduced in 1921 as in the presentation. It really gained a lot of popularity in the early days of computing. When I was working at IBM, we called it we had this the stencil came in a yellow sleeve and you could keep it in your pocket and you can whip it out and do a little flow chart. But we used it a lot when I was at school and in the early days when I worked for IBM way back in the day. But there is an international standard that defines it. And that's something I really want to point out here. One of the important things about process is, and if you're trying to communicate things effectively and consistently, is standardizing the way you do it. And I'm not going to tell you one standard is better than another standard, but if you're going to adopt a standard way of documenting your processes, you should actually use the standard because it's a language that communicates, and you should use the right vocabulary and the right, the right lingo, if you will, in documenting. So use the right symbols for the right things. But the ISO standard for flowcharting is ISO 5807 and was last reviewed in 2019. So, it's still around. What I like about flowcharting is there's a limited number of symbols. It makes it kind of easy to learn, There's only a handful of things you got to understand. And so that's a good thing. The bad side about it is maybe it can't really define the most complex processes. And flowcharts, and I see mistakes in this all the time, flowcharts are supposed to be read from top to bottom, left to right. I've seen flowcharts where they're going in every single direction and it's like a big bowl of spaghetti and it's hard to follow. So there is, traditionally a flowchart based on the standard should be read from top to bottom, left to right. Like I said, there's really just a handful of symbols that represent flowcharting. So you got your terminator, which is a start and stop. A process step is something you're going to do, a decision you're going to make. This symbol, the parallelogram, represents data either being brought into the process or data produced by the process. Predefined process. So let's say, in my employee expense reporting process, I want to hand it off to finance. There might be a finance process that's separate from the one I'm documenting, but is called by this process. You got your flow line. You can make notes on your process flow with annotations. You've got off-page connectors, on-page connectors, and you can also produce documents. Real simple process flowchart. Here's a decision-making flowchart for going to work or school. So wake up. Are you on time? No? Oh, call in sick. End of process. So we're flowing down, or we can read left to right. How's the water pressure in the shower? Call in sick. If the water pressure is okay, ask yourself, is it rainy or snowy? That's kind of rainy, call in sick. If you feel like working, nope, call in sick. If you get through all of those steps and you feel like working, sure, you got to get going, and then you end the process. But again, it flows from top to bottom, left to right, and that's how you read a process flowcharting map. And again, it's all about terminologies, you know. Thanks, Stacy. Another type of flowcharting, so where you combine, you can combine the symbols I just showed, is swimlane diagrams. And swimlane diagrams are part of process mapping, and they really show the handoffs between various departments. They're really great from that perspective because they visually distinguish roles for the different steps in the process. So it brings another dimension to, you know, to the flowchart. It actually adds the dimension of who's responsible. And as I said earlier, a process is the what and who, and the procedures are the how. Lanes can be organized either horizontally or vertically in a swimlane diagram. They can be used with standard flowcharting symbols, like the ones I just showed you, or the ones I'm going to, at least some of them that I'm going to introduce in a moment, business process modeling and notation symbols or UML symbols. So you can use different symbols in a flowchart. I had to go to work part. I had to get going. But maybe anyway. Flowcharting symbols, BPMN symbols, UML symbols can be used within the swim lane. They can be combined with something called phase lines to show changes in states, and I'll demonstrate that in a minute. So change in state, you know, well, think of an Amazon thing. So when you first make your order, you know, that's an open order, and then you'll get notification that your product is shipped. Then you'll get notification that the product has been delivered. Those would be different states in the process, and you can use those in conjunction with a swim lane diagram. So here's a swim lane diagram, very simple. There might be, you know, it's not intended to be the be all and end all of the expense approval process, but we start with the employee. He or she submits an expense, goes off to the manager to do a review. The manager will look at it, and if it's not approved, they'll go back and come back into the employee. If it's approved, it gets handed off to the finance department, where they process the expense report. They submit it for payment, which might go off to a finance process here. Then they'll notify the employee. The employee gets notified through an email that the check is in the mail, so to speak. The employee will validate the payment because they got the reimbursement, which is an input to the employee, and they'll close the record and you come to an end. If you want to show the states, you can add another layer on top of the swim lanes. So you can have something called a phase line, and this phase is new. This phase is work in progress, and this phase is closed. So it just brings yet another dimension to the diagram. So you can learn a lot from this single diagram. You know who's doing what. You know exactly where the handoffs are. You know what phase of the process you're in, so you can lend some insight to the people automating the process in a tool. There's a lot of information on this particular swim lane diagram. You can also organize swim lanes in a vertical manner. So this is the same process. It goes from employee to manager to finance, and then back around to employee. You might find this, again, there's different circumstances that might lend themselves better to a vertical swim lane as opposed to a horizontal swim lane. But, you know, they all kind of lead to the same end. And you can, also put phase lines in here. I didn't put that in my presentation, but you could draw some phase lines in this as well. I think that gets a little complex with a vertical swim lane personally. I'm more of a fan of this horizontal swim lane with the phase lines. Is probably, if I was going to document a process, that would be the technique I would use. What is the general function of a dashed line in swim lane diagram? If you're referring to these dashed lines I have here, I'm going to have a section on this later about the different connectors and again, you know, you don't have to do what we're saying here, right? But there's a standard, and you'll notice that I've used the dotted lines as inputs and outputs. So they're not a flow of the process. They're adding something to the process in the form of an input or output. That's why I use the dotted line, and the solid line designates the actual flow. So that's how I do it. It doesn't mean, that's just my technique. But again, it makes it clear that that's not a flow in the step. That's actually an output that's being produced or an input that's being received by the process. Now there's another twist on swimlane diagrams. This was something I learned about back in my day at IBM, back in the day. It's called line of visibility modeling, sometimes called LOVM. So it's a type of swim lane, but the key thing, and it was created by IBM to model workflows, but the key thing is the top lane always represents the customer or user, the person who's initiates and receives value from the process. So if you look across the top line, if you're dealing with if it's a customer, right? If this is your customer, these are the places where you interact with the customer. The top lane always represents the customer or user. The middle lanes, that's where you perform the process, right? That you receive the order, review the order, you assemble the order, you prepare the order for shipment, you ship the order, and away you go. And the bottom line always represents data or tools. So if you want to know where you're, and someone asked this question earlier on in the presentation, I don't recall who, the question was asked, where do you show interaction with systems? This is a perfect example of where you can show interaction with systems. And by putting it at the bottom lane, it's not being all blended in with the rest of the stuff. You're seeing it in a distinct lane, so you can see all the interactions, and you just look up and you figure where that was involved. So the bottom lane always represents the data or the tools used to support the process. These parts here are your moments of truth. I don't know if anyone out there has heard the term moment of truth. It's a term in customer service. This is where in customer service, your moment of truth is, when you walk into Starbucks and when that clerk takes your order and smiles and is nice and friendly, that's a moment of truth. They snarl at you or they get your order wrong or your name wrong, that's a moment of truth. This is where you can make it or break it in terms of customer satisfaction. So these are the moments of truth in this particular process. Stacy was asking, how do you determine if a process is more suitable for vertical or horizontal swim lane diagrams? Yeah, I struggle with that one. I'm a fan of the horizontal swim lanes. I think if you're looking at creating your more traditional top to bottom flow, laying them up vertically can work, but then you have a lot of swinging back into the rolls as opposed to going straight through. Hard to say. I'm sorry, Stacy. I don't really have a good answer to that question. I tend to always go with the horizontal swim lanes. I find they work better for me, and I'll just leave it at that. Yeah. So line of visibility modeling. It's just a slight tweak on swim lanes so that you can actually see those moments of truth where you interact with the customer. And I'm sure. That's a good point, Nazalia. How complex the diagram is a good point in determining the two. I think if it's a real messy diagram, I think vertical swim lanes gets a little hard to follow. But then horizontal swim lanes can get very wide if it's a complex process. But we're going to talk about that later, about taking some of the complexity out of processes. This is one of the slides I have coming up. But anyway, I like this because knowing your moments of truth is really meaning you're putting the focus on the user or the customer, right? Which is why you're doing the process in the first place. All right, business process model and notation, BPMN. Anyone here BPMN? Oh yes, Rick. Yes, interaction with external processes also belong on the bottom. You're correct. And I'll be showing that in another slide, but good catch, Rick. Business process model and notation. It's a form of process mapping. BPMN is a graphical notation for specifying business processes in a business process diagram. It's maintained by the object management group. So that group, they maintain a whole host of standards, but one of the standards that they maintain is the business process modeling notation. The latest version is 2.02, as far as I know, and it was published in 2014. So it's fairly current. The goal, like in all mapping standards, is to provide a common language to define processes. Supports process file sharing through XML files. So there is a standard import-export format for business process modeling notation, so you can share it amongst tools. It supports process execution and workflow automation. So business process, if many of the workflow automation platforms, one that comes to the top of mind is Camunda. Camunda actually uses BPMN notation to help model the workflow automation in their workflow automation platform. But there's a caveat with that, and I'll get to that in a moment. Well, this is the caveat. BPMN is sometimes called a visual programming language, because if you're going to use BPMN to automatically generate a workflow routine, it has to be very specific, right? Because if you're telling it exactly every single thing it needs to do to automate that workflow, that flowchart has to have everything in it, or else how is the automation platform going to interpret it? It's got to be very detailed. And as such, the BPMN language can become very complex. This is a simple example of business process modeling notation, and you'll notice a couple of things here. They have symbols that represent data inputs and outputs. So this is a data input over here, data output. They have their different tasks have actual little symbols in the top corner, and those symbols, and there's like 7 or 8 in total that represent a script, a service, an email communication, a manual task. So they designate in the boxes what kind of task it is. They have different gateways, so you can flow. They have events. So events are basically things like a message event, an escalation event, a timer event. Over here, make the booking. If you have an error making the booking, that's what that little symbol means, is error. You go off and do a notification of a failed booking. So there's actually quite a bit of detail, and I would consider this a very simple BPMN map. BPMN has a ton of symbols. And before I get any further, I'm just going to go back into this slide. I'm just going to go back a little bit. Do we have another session workshop for this? I think the content will not be able to cover this. Ankit, I'm not sure of your question, whether the different process models available, which one is recommended, and can you give some example and use cases? So just looking at the different ones I'm showing here, flowcharting, very simple and easy to understand. Most anyone you show it to will get it. BPMN, you can see the number of symbols they have. And all of these symbols have modifiers. So all of these tasks can be modified with parallel, sequential, ad hoc, compensation, or loop markers. All of these events can either be start, intermediate, non-interrupting, or end. It's a very complex language. At the simplest level, BPMN, the use case is you could use it for business process. The real use case, in my opinion, for business process modeling notation, if you need the process documented at the most detailed level to hand off like extremely detailed workflow automation requirements. But again, the only people who will understand the workflow are people who are trained in the business process modeling and notation language. Because, as you can see, the permutations and combinations here are vast. And the average user will not be able to read one of these diagrams without some substantial training. And it makes it a little inaccessible to people. So back to your use cases, flowcharting, pretty accessible. We've all probably done some flowcharting in school. Very few of us have done real business process modeling notation. Is BPMN important? Of course it is, because it gets down to that level of detail that is critical for some use cases. But it is at a level that it's not a process document. It's not a process map you can throw in front of somebody and expect them to understand fully what's going on inside of it. So it's a little more complex. SIPOC diagrams. Does anyone know what SIPOC diagrams are? Well, SIPOC diagrams are really I love SIPOC diagrams because they're your process on a page. So you have your suppliers. Suppliers are any role, system, or inter-process connection that provides inputs to the process. So a supplier, so we talked about inputs, process, and outputs, but who is the supplier of an input? So in this employee expense process, we have the employee, the financial department, and a manager. They are the suppliers of information. The employee supplies the expense report. The finance department, supplies is a supplier of the checks and things like that. Managers, they're suppliers because they have requests that come into the process. They want to see what the outstanding expense reports are. The finance department might want to ask what the outstanding expense reports are. So those are suppliers. Then you have your inputs. Then you have the process. And you notice there's only 4 things in this process because it's the process activities, not those detailed tasks or work instructions or procedures. I got a procedure on my desk the other day that it had 60-something steps in it. You don't want a one-page chart with 60 some odd steps. This is meant to be a starting point to decompose your process for process improvement. So you want to make sure you're capturing the major details, not getting into the weeds here. So suppliers, inputs, process, outputs, and customers. So on one page, you know who the customers are, you know who your suppliers are, you know what the ins and outs are. So there's your suppliers, any role, system, or inter-process connection that provides inputs to the process. An input is a trigger for the process. So what kicks off the process? It's an input. Here's a change request that kicks off the process. Here's a request for information that kicks off the process. It's a trigger. Why are triggers important? Because they're important for automation. Inputs are something transformed, used, or consumed by the process. There's the process activities, a set of activities. Remember, I say activities, not tasks, that turn an input into a value-added output. The outputs are a value-added result produced by the process, and customers are any role, system, or inter-process connection that receives outputs from the process. That's a SIPOC diagram. I love them. It's a great starting point to really provide a lot of information on a single page. Somebody was asking about RACI charts. Someone's getting echoing now. Catherine and I are in completely separate rooms, so there's only one mic in here. So anyone else experiencing echoing? Catherine, are you experiencing echoing? Okay. RACI charts. RACI charts are a concise visual representation of the roles and responsibilities for each team member in a project or process. So you've got roles across the top. You've got the steps in the process down vertically laid out down the left-hand column, and then where they intersect, you have one of the RACI values: responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. So R represents the person who's responsible for the successful completion of the task. So if I'm submitting the expense is the step, it would be obviously the employee that would be responsible for submitting the expense report. Although you can have in the same column for the same task, you can have multiple roles because someone might be consulted. As an employee, I might consult my manager, hey, am I allowed to expense this? Or I might want to inform someone that I've submitted the expense report. So for one task, you can have multiple RACI values. R is who's responsible. A is who's accountable. So it's the person typically overseeing, the responsible person, the person with the ultimate accountability for this task being done. So they're not the ones so much that are doing it, but they're accountable for making sure it's done. As a manager, I'm going to make sure you submit your expense reports. I'm accountable for that, up to my boss. But as an employee, you're responsible for submitting your expense report. Consulted, there's people with specialized knowledge. Maybe I want to go to the, hey, am I allowed expensing this? Is this tax deductible? Or I have to consult with someone for information. And I means informed. This is people who should be regularly updated on the process to ensure transparency. So that's RACI. I like RACI. RACI and SIPOC, those two things provide a lot of information about the process, right? Just a lot of information on two diagrams. You bring in the process maps, you've got and process, and the other point I'm trying to making, process mapping goes beyond flow charting, right? So other diagrams become part of the process mapping exercise, because process mapping is creating a visual representation, and charts like SIPOC and RACI are visual representations of the process. They're just not in flow charting language, but they are visual representations of the process. All right, collaborative process mapping. You cannot create a process map in isolation. You know, if your boss says, go document the XYZ process, you can't go to your desk and do that. You've got to get out and you've got to talk to people. You need to work collaboratively with team members familiar with the execution of the process. That's the only way you're going to be able to understand it. It's part of the process discovery and process mapping phase of the business process management cycle. Engaging your stakeholders is critical when designing and documenting your processes, and for a lot of reasons. If you're building out a process, involving the others enhances buy-in and ownership. If they're putting input into your process, they're more likely to follow your process. It's basic organizational change management, OCM, organizational change management. So engaging your stakeholders are great for buy-in and ownership. Nobody wants to get a process just dropped on them from above. It also improves the understanding of the business needs, because you're actually talking to the people who do the work, right? So by engaging the stakeholders, it gives you much better clarity. It helps identify bottlenecks and inefficiencies, because you're interviewing and talking to people. Hey, what's working? What's not working? I have to hand this off to so-and-so, and then I got to wait for that to come back. And, oh, wow, that's a bottleneck. Maybe we can do something about it. And you're only going to learn that by talking to people. It fosters innovation and design thinking, being creative about the process, because you've got other ideas coming into the mix. It supports a culture of collaboration, because you're involving people. And there's various techniques you can use to engage your stakeholders. So process assessments, and by the way, a lot of the stuff that I've been talking about, hey, Nazia, would you like me to? You want me to come and tell your boss that? Thanks. That made me smile. There's a lot of this material that I talked about. If you go to our website, navia.com/blog, we've got more detailed presentations. We have a whole webinar on process assessments, a whole webinar on process documentation. So if you go to our website, this is an overview workshop here, but there's a lot of detailed stuff up at navia.com/blog. And Catherine, you can maybe point to some of those articles when you send out the slides later. Process assessments, interviews. So a process assessment is like what's working, what's not working. It's talking to people. It's measuring process capability, maybe against a scale, like a 1 to 5 capability maturity model. So assessments can give you a lot of information that provides input into the process mapping. Interviews, like actually talking to people. Process workshops, where you get the gang together. I mean, I was in a workshop once where, it was like this workshop was the first time these people spoke to each other, because they had no idea what the others were doing. It's fascinating sometimes. So the process workshops brings people together. You really do that? I didn't know you did that. Oh, well, here's a better way of doing that. Observation of the process in action. You can't, before you document the process, you should probably go out and learn what the process is about, and maybe go speak to, see it actually operating. You want, as you're mapping your process, you also want to go back and validate with people that what you've captured is in fact accurate. So you don't trust that you're going to get all of this information right the first time. Validate your process with others. You also want to review any documentation that might exist. I know there's some folks out there who are in a new process management group. I identified I saw you guys sign in. Beverly is one. You're going to have to run out and see what documentation does exist. Maybe assess how things are working, interview people, because in organizations that might not have a lot of documented process in place, this is a great way of going out and engaging the folks. Process analysis. Once you have your process mapped, we typically call that the as-is process. You can use techniques like value stream mapping. So value stream mapping, and again, this is not a presentation on value stream mapping, but it's a technique for looking for things that like cycle time and the flow of the flow of the production and the cycle time. It's a very valuable tool for identifying bottlenecks. We might have this is the first in a series of process workshops, so we might get into some of these things in future workshops. But value stream mapping is a great way to analyze your process. So is root cause analysis. RCA is an actual technique to identify using a structured methodology where the issues are in your processes. Kaizen events, where you bring people together, you bring your various stakeholders together, and you look at getting quick improvements to the processes through Kaizen events, part of Six Sigma. Process mining, using automation and tools to go out. Now, remember, so these process mining tools, you put agents out in the network and they can detect when an order goes from system A to system B. So they're very good at mining the technological interactions, not so good at mining out the human element of the process. But process mining is another way of analyzing your process for bottlenecks. Process simulations, sometimes called digital twins. A process simulation, kind of cool, but it's like anything, you have to put a lot of work into the simulation to make sure it actually simulates your process, right? And for a simple process, that might be simple. For a very complex process, there's a lot of work that has to go in creating an accurate simulation, but process simulations can be used. And then you get all that done and you can map what's called the 2B process, and that is your refined process. The goal of process analysis is you're looking for efficiency by eliminating bottlenecks, delays, redundancies, or waste. You want to improve the effectiveness of your process by ensuring the processes are aligned with your corporate objectives. You want to enhance customer satisfaction by optimizing customer-facing processes. That's very important. Remember my love 'em slide from way back, the moments of truth? I mean, you want to make an impact, look at the customer-facing processes, see what you can do about optimizing them, get your users on board with you, make them happy. You might get a lot more support for your process improvement initiatives. And then driving innovation. That's another thing that process analysis will do, because it gives you insight into what you can automate or what you might want to apply digital transformation to. Is process mapping the same as process documentation? Anybody want to comment on that? To me, it's a big no. There's a lot more to a process than the process maps, right? There's more to your process documentation than the process maps. Do you have, before I get into this, when to use journey mapping versus process mapping. I have an old saying, a customer journey map is the ultimate process. It's a different technique. Right? It's a different technique, customer journey mapping, because you're looking at personas and you're looking at, so you have various personas and you're looking how they're interacting with their needs, their wishes, their wants. It's another approach, and I think customer journey mapping is important, but customer journey mapping and process is a little bit different, but they work hand in hand. So I think if you're really looking at improving customer experience, journey mapping could really apply. If you're looking at creating, a map of what's actually going on, what needs to be automated and improved, that's where a process map comes in. Before I go on. Process description, goals, and objectives. So it's context. What is this process about? What are we trying to achieve? What are the objectives? Who are all the roles involved in the process? List all the people. Describe that role. What's the RACI chart? Process maps, yes, that's part of your process documentation. But then you also want to spell out the activities and tasks. A box on a flowchart doesn't give enough detail. You want to provide the detail about those steps on the process flow. You want to have all your inputs and your outputs, your controls, your metrics, your policies documented, all the procedural information, as well as maybe any user stories or technical requirements you need to automate this process. So there's a lot more to your process documentation than just the process map. So we do have a presentation on best practices in process documentation. It's one of the webinars up on our website, so you could check that one out. But they're, so process maps are a part of process documentation, but they're not the only thing. Okay, let's talk about creating process maps now. Anyone ever draw a process that looks a little like this? So I've seen this many a time. Very, very complex processes, difficult to follow. If you put them on a piece of paper, they're hard to read because there's just 60, 70 elements on the process. But remember my discussion earlier about process levels and activities and tasks? So in this process, you might find there are different activities. Submit a request, analyze a request, approve a request, fulfill the request, close out the request, as an example. In this complex process can be many activities. And I would submit that a better way of laying this out is more like this. Here's my activity one. It's in the context of something very specific, like this is incident management. Create a new incident ticket, verify the user's information, capture the details of the incident. Is it really an incident or is it a service request? Provide a unique incident number. That's part of activity one, but you're seeing it in the context of that activity. It's easy to follow, easy to read. You can see where it touches systems and tools, where data is inputted and outputted. You can see where the customers are notified, and you're not having to read this whole map to try to figure out what's going on, and it can print out on one page. You might have a lot of activities in your process, but it's a good way of organizing them. Another thing about creating your process diagrams is making sure you have standards. Process maps are the language that describes your business processes. You should conform to we should all speak the same language so we can understand each other. So a common process mapping language will improve communication. We talked about those use cases. It doesn't really matter if you use flowcharting or swim lanes or business process modeling notation. It's having a standard that you follow and everybody understands. That will improve communication and facilitate understanding. And again, you should try to adopt a single mapping approach. It may not always be the case, but because maybe there are some times where you have to get really detailed with business process modeling notation. The good thing about business process modeling notation, you could keep it at a high level as well. You don't have to use all 200 and some odd symbols. So again, you should pick one and stick with that one, because when someone picks up a process for Department A and picks it up for Department B, it'll look the same. They'll have the same language, the same flow, the same feel. So that's why you should adopt a single. Provide training on that standard. Consider using dedicated business process analysts. This is a pet peeve of mine. It's a skill to design processes, to interview people, to run the workshops, to map out the process, to know the tools. There's a skill. And a lot of people say, oh, no, we'll just, everyone, you're responsible for defining your own process. And what you're going to get is chaos. So if your organization can support it, consider using dedicated business process analysts to work with the business. Okay, before I wrap up here, I do want to show something else. And of course, I'm logged out. I just want to show some of this stuff in action a little bit. So I'm using our tool here, which is called Navia. And I just created something here for the process mapping workshop. So in the Navia tool, you can do process maturity assessments through the survey. You can design and document your processes and capture evidence of compliance. So I've got a couple of processes I worked on here for the workshop. I can go into my sample process. And you can see here, this is now more than just the process map, because it's also the process documentation. I've got the overview of the process with a description. I've got the goal of the process. I got the objectives of the process. I can take a look at any of the objectives. I can see all the different roles in the process and the description of those roles. I can see the systems that support the process, attachments and links, a glossary of terms. What's a RACI model? What's a receipt? What's an expense report? I can see my control objectives, which are the the controls, metrics, policies, and governance, and my specifications for implementing a process. In the workflow, I've got my expense approval process here. If I want to add some swim lanes to this, sorry, I have swim lanes, but if I want to add some phase lines, I can add a phase line, multiple phase lines, move those things around. But what's different about this process map is we've got a whole host of information here about a description. And I always recommend that the task should be almost verbs, right? Submit, review, process, submit, notify, validate. And then here you have the description of what actually gets done in this step of the process. And then you can also capture things like roles, inputs, outputs, user stories, procedures, all in one place. But you have your process map and then all of that detail that supports the other levels in the process. And then what's kind of neat about this is I can just pop over here and produce the process document that would include the process maps. So from that information that was captured in the database, here's the description of the process. Here's my objectives. Here's all the roles in the process with a description of the role. Here's my RACI chart for the process. And then it gets into the various flow diagrams and a description of the steps. So it's a nice way of combining both your process documentation with your maps. But if you want to export your maps just by themselves, no problem. Just export your maps the way you want. A couple of things I want to point out here about the details. I am a big believer that a flow should go left to right. You go into a task, out from a task. In from a task, out from a task. If you come back around, it goes back into the input. So these are the inputs to a task. These are the outputs of the task. If you're connecting to a system or a piece of information, I like to use the dotted lines. So create the request. So what the output of that step is a request, a ticket in the system. When we submit the request, we update the request system. Here's a database that represents a system. If I'm going to notify a user, I notify the user. So you've got your main flow, and then you can see your inputs and your outputs. The other thing I like to do is I like to create a sweep path through, I call it the sweep path. Every process has like the path of least resistance. If everything went perfect in your process, how would it go? Well, this is the dark line. Boom, 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 right? There's your dark line. That's the sweep path. Here's the exceptions. No, right? You can go backwards. So I like to do that as well, so visually it's clean. You can see the main flow of the process, but you can also see all your data elements. You can see I tend to employ the love 'em technique with my data and systems on the bottom and my my employee up on top, my customer interactions. That's the way I like to do it. And you can go the old vertical swim lane. Navia does the vertical swim lanes too. Like all the slides I did in the presentation, I just produced out of Navia. So let me hey, you know what? I'm pretty much on time. I'm shocked. I never did this workshop before, so to be on time is, I'm pretty proud of myself, if I don't mind saying it. So let's do a little bit of a wrap up. Process mapping is an essential business tool, and it's part of the business process management cycle. Consider using process levels to categorize your business processes, right? Organize them. Where in the company, what group of processes, the process, its activities, its tasks, its procedures. Great way of organizing things. Differentiate between process, activities, tasks, and procedures. You can also differentiate between policies and metrics, but differentiate between them. They're different things, right? And they have different purposes. One is the 60,000 foot view, and another is like right down in the weeds. If you only have things that go into the weeds, nobody can see the big picture and you can't improve things. Settle on a common process mapping standard, whether that's BPMN, whether that's flowcharting, whether it's UML, whether it's other techniques. And a few people mentioned those in the chat. I'm not familiar with all of them, but it really doesn't matter. Let's just all speak the same language. There's more to process documentation than a flow diagram. In many organizations, from my experience as a consultant, all they have are flow diagrams and they don't have the rest of the stuff. And that rest of the devil's in the detail, right? You need the rest of the stuff. Be collaborative when designing your processes. Engage your stakeholders because only they know what's going on. And use the maps to improve efficiency, reduce waste, and automate your processes. Someone asked earlier if there was a trial of Navia. There is. Learn how Navia can help your business process management perform. You can either go to navia.com/contact to schedule a meeting, or there's free trials and all sorts of stuff. I do highly recommend going to the Navia blog. There's a lot of great information that's not salesy. It's not sales related stuff. It's just best practices on process management, on IT service management, and a variety of other things. So, hey, it's 11:01. What do you guys think? I amazed myself here. So I want to thank you all for, I know it was a big investment of your time. I do appreciate that. I really hope you got something out of this session here today. I mean, I tried to provide I tried my best to provide a session that was accessible to a variety of people, that covered information at a variety of levels. So hopefully you were able to get some benefits out of that. I appreciate the feedback that's coming in. I want to thank you all. We run these webinars, typically every 6 or 8 weeks. And these workshops are a new addition that we're putting into the mix. So the webinars, they're all informational, right? We try to stay away from having things that are too salesy. So they're all informational. Webinars, we tend to have a guest, a customer or someone who's known in the industry. And then this new segment here, the workshops, we try to get a little bit deeper. And I actually might break out some of the stuff that's in this workshop and bring it to bear in future sessions. So consider this introduction to process mapping. Again, I thank you all for the information that's coming back. Appreciate it so much.